Magnus Carlsen destroys Hans Niemann with the move 1a3. Are you kidding me? Now, this game took place in the 2022 FTX Crypto Cup. Magnus just lost the prior match versus Hans. He wants revenge, and to get it, he opens with the move 1a3. That is about as disrespectful as it gets. Oh my goodness, the audacity of Magnus Carlsen. Now, in the game, Hans responds d5, solid move. Magnus d4. Both sides bring out their knights, and here the big choices for Hans Niemann are going to be the moves c5, e6, or g6. c5 is probably the most principled option, trying to strike on the queen side. However, e6 and g6 are both also pretty solid as well. Well, instead of those main options, here Hans Niemann goes for the London system move. That is bishop to f5, and now you can see it's basically a reverse London, except white also has that extra move a2 to a3 in this position. Now, unfortunately for Hans Niemann, I think this bishop move here as black is slightly premature, and white can gain some sort of initiative starting with the move c4 as Magnus Carlsen played in the game. Now here, Hans Niemann c6, and as is typical in these Slav lines where the bishop comes out early, Magnus Carlsen has the chance to try and take advantage of that awkward placement of the bishop. So for example, one possible line is c takes, and then queen to b3, ganging up on both the b7 pawn and applying more pressure to d5. And anytime you get these Slav structures where black brings the bishop out too early to the f5 square, this idea is possible. Now instead of that, Magnus played another pretty solid move here, knight to c3, just continuing development of the queen side, and now Hans Niemann e6. So he goes ahead and completes that Slav triangle in the middle of the board with the bishop outside of the pawn chain. Now, there is one drawback of having this bishop out early besides pressuring the weak b7 pawn, and that is the idea of knight to h4, trying to win the bishop pair as Magnus Carlsen does in the game. Now from here, Hans Niemann has a big choice. Where do you put the bishop? And the best squares are going to be either g6 or g4. And in this particular position, g4 is not the best square for the bishop, but unfortunately, that is what Hans Niemann goes for in the game, and this move already threatens to completely ruin his position. Now, real fast, instead of this, bishop g6 was the right choice. If Magnus ever takes the bishop, black is going to take back with the h-pawn, and yes, his pawn structure is going to be a little bit weaker on the queen side after this kind of trade. However, the rook is actually pretty active on the open h-file, and that extra double g-pawn can act as a battering ram, pushing down the board in certain lines, so overall, it's not too bad for black. Now, of course, instead of that, bishop g4 on the board, and why is this move in particular so weak here? Well, if Magnus Carlsen wanted to, he could have gone for the incredibly strong forcing line starting with the move h3. The idea is you just want to kick that bishop all the way back to the g6 square and then take it. So for example, bishop h5, g4, bishop g6, and then the key idea, you take the bishop on the g6 square, knight takes g6, h takes, and then g5, hitting the knight, gaining more space on the king side, and overall, white has a really pleasant position here. However, instead of that, Magnus Carlsen, I mean, he is an aficionado of these really strange-looking pawn moves, and he does not disappoint here. He plays the very strange-looking move f3. Now, this move is not completely ridiculous. There are some lines in the slow Slav where white does go for f3, trying to pressure the bishop. Sometimes the king actually goes to the g2 square via f2 and then g2. So it's not completely ridiculous. However, in this specific position, it's not really the strongest idea. Now, from here, Hans Niemann retreats the bishop to the h5 square, best square for the bishop, and Magnus Carlsen takes on d5, and Hans Niemann takes back. And now here, Magnus plays a very important stabilizing move. That is simply g3, a very good multi-purpose idea. Now, first of all, in this position before g3, this knight on h4 is actually somewhat vulnerable. As you can see, the queen on the d8 square has some sort of x-ray pressure on that knight. If black ever went, for example, after white wastes a move and black somehow got a knight e4 at some point, that knight on the h4 square would be hanging. Now, of course, not a good idea in this exact position, but as you can see, there is that x-ray pressure on the knight, and for that reason, g3 simply shuts that down immediately. However, beyond that, the king may want to go to the g2 square via f2 and then g2 at some point, so g3 sets that up perfectly, and playing g3 right away overall, best move in the position by far. Now, Hans, knight c6, developing the queen side, and Magnus Carlsen, knight to g2. I mean, interesting reroute for the knight. I suppose his idea might be knight to g4 at some point, trying to win that bishop. So let's see what he has in mind. Here, Hans Niemann, queen b6. Good square for the queen, applying some pressure on these weak squares in Magnus Carlsen's position. And now Magnus, e3, simply defending d4. Of course, the one drawback of this move is that bishop on the c1 square is now blocked inside the pawn chain. So we'll see how that plays out for Magnus here. Now Hans Niemann, bishop d6. Logical developing move, pairing castles on the king side. Good stuff. And here Magnus has a big choice to make. How does he want to continue developing? Now, the best idea here, at least according to Stockfish, is simply going to be bishop e2, then short castles. So for example, bishop e2, now both sides castle on the king side, and overall Magnus is going to have a relatively solid position. Nothing really to worry about, although Hans Niemann is technically a little bit better here. However, instead of that, here Magnus Carlsen, once again, he is just determined to shock his younger opponent with some wild-looking moves. Here he jumps forward with the knight to the f4 square, knight f4, and technically this move is quite dubious because Hans Niemann has a really strong reply here, and that is the simple move bishop takes f4. And now, no matter how Magnus Carlsen responds, he's going to have some major weaknesses in his pawn structure. Now, the best recapture is going to be recapturing towards the center with the g-pawn. G takes f4, but now Hans Niemann can simply castle on the king side, and there's really no threat against the king. Yes, white does have that open g-file. However, bishop g6 is pretty much going to permanently stop any sort of attack on the g-file. And here, Hans Niemann is just super solid, and it's not really clear what white is doing with his weakened pawn structure. Now, instead of that, I think Hans Niemann maybe gave Magnus Carlsen a little bit too much credit. He wasn't willing to go for that more combative line, and instead he simply retreats his bishop back to the g6 square, bishop to g6. And yes, Hans Niemann is doing fine. He's still a little bit better, but I think he missed a big opportunity with bishop takes f4 on the move prior. Now from here, Magnus, he starts to finish development. He starts taking the bishop on g6, knight takes g6, h takes g6, and then he artificially castles his king to the g2 square like we talked about earlier. King f2, a6, and then king to g2. Now having the king on the g2 square is quite important. It does defend the h2 pawn, meaning the rook on h1 is free to move into the game without dropping the pawn on h2. And beyond that, the king got out of different checks, jumping with the knight jumping into the e4 or g4 squares like it would if the king was still on the f2 square. Now from here, Hans Niemann, short castles, and Magnus here, his best plan is probably going to be slow development, maybe queen c2, bishop e2, bishop d2, getting his rooks into the game. But instead of that, he lashes out on the king side. The creative genius Magnus Carlsen just cannot help himself. He goes for it with the move g4. I mean, folks, if you're watching this at home, don't try this at home. This is a Magnus Carlsen special in this position. And here Hans Niemann strikes back in the center, very classical chess move, e5. But does Magnus Carlsen care? No, he just continues with the attack. Probably not the best idea. Perhaps the best move is taking on e5 first and then g5. But Magnus, he goes for it, g5. And here Hans Niemann, he has a big choice to make. What do you do about this attack on the knight? And he decides the best course of action, and I think he's right, is to simply ignore the threat and counterattack on the d4 square. E takes d4. And now, of course, if Magnus takes on f6, Hans is going to take on the c3 square, and both sides are having their positions completely blown open. Now, that doesn't quite happen here. Instead, Magnus immediately takes back on the d4 square. E takes d4, and Hans Niemann jumps forward with the knight to the h5 square, the knight now eyeing the f4 square, and that could spell danger for Magnus Carlsen in this game. However, very important to note, that knight is no longer defending the d5 square. So now if we look at this position, both sides have their pawns on the d-file hanging. Hans Niemann, his d5 pawns hanging to the knight, and Magnus, his d4 pawn, also hanging to the knight on the c6 square. And as you may have guessed, things are about to get very complicated. Here, Magnus ignores the threat on the d-pawn. He just jumps forward, knight takes d5, hitting black's queen. What the heck is Hans Niemann supposed to do? Does he move the queen? Does he take the pawn on d4? What's it going to be? Well, in the game, he decides to trade down to a slightly better endgame with the move queen takes d4. Solid move, perhaps not the best though. Here I think a better idea may have been simply queen to d8, defending for now. And yes, white does win an extra pawn. However, the benefit here for black is he does keep the queens on the board, and white's king on the g2 square is incredibly vulnerable. I mean, just look at the bishop slicing here, the knight jumping into f4, queen eyeing the g5 square, and meanwhile, Hans Niemann's king is perfectly safe on that g8 square. So overall, this would have been a very dangerous pawn sacrifice from Hans. Instead of that, queen takes d4 played in the game. Now, the drawback of this move is Magnus Carlsen does have the chance to trade down into an endgame, and that is exactly what he does. Queen takes d4, knight takes d4, and it's important to note here, this is not your typical endgame. Magnus Carlsen does have the bishop pair here. That is a huge asset. However, his pawns on the king side are very weak. So this endgame is going to be all about Magnus trying to strengthen his bishop pair and Hans Niemann trying to shut them down, making his knights as strong as possible and trying to capitalize on these weak pawns on the king side. Now, first of all, the immediate threat from Hans is going to be knight to b3, forking the rook and the bishop, simply winning back that bishop and eliminating Magnus Carlsen's bishop pair. Magnus is having none of that. Rook to b1 is his move, stopping the fork. Very, very good. And now from here, both sides start to centralize their pieces. Hans getting his rooks into the game, Magnus doing the same thing. And now from here, both sides continue developing, continue centralizing, and here we start to have some exchanges on the board. Hans Niemann jumping in with the knight. Some of the knights get traded off, and in my opinion, this is good for Magnus Carlsen. As more and more pieces get traded off the board, this bishop pair is going to be stronger and stronger relative to Hans Niemann's two minor pieces. Now, of course, here the immediate threat is the king is under check. He's going to have to move the king, but the big factor in this position for Magnus Carlsen is now the weak pawns on the queen side for Hans Niemann. As we can see, if we get one bishop perhaps coming into e3, these bishops are both going to slice down the board, and these pawns are going to be incredibly vulnerable. So just watch as Magnus Carlsen starts to clean up on the queen side. First, moves his king. Hans Niemann b6 trying to defend, but then Magnus jumps in with the bishop to b7, forking the rook and the pawn on the a6 square. Now Hans tries to defend, but Magnus already winning one of these pawns, and believe it or not, this one pawn of Hans is much more vulnerable than Magnus Carlsen's two pawns here. Oh no, this is not looking good for Hans Niemann. Okay, Hans, knight d6, trying to centralize, Magnus bishop c4, and here Magnus Carlsen, the next phase of this game is he's going to push these pawns down the queen side, trying to get a pass pawn on the queen side. Perhaps one pawn from each side gets traded off. Let's see how Magnus does it. Knight d4, king g2, defending the pawn on the f3 square. Of course, the knight was attacking it. And now from here, we get sort of this long shuffling phase where Magnus Carlsen slowly but surely improves his position, starts to push his pawns up the board, starts to centralize his king, and this continues for a few more moves up until right about this position right here. Now here, Hans Niemann put Magnus Carlsen's king in check. However, Magnus has an absolutely beautiful tactical shot in this position. If you like puzzles, go ahead and pause the video right now. This is a simple one, but it's very, very important. I'd be, really impressed if you're a lower rated player and you managed to find this. All right, did you find it? The key ID here for Magnus Carlsen is the temporary rook sacrifice. Rook takes c5. The idea is no matter what Hans Niemann does in response, Magnus Carlsen is going to simplify the position. So for example here, if Hans Niemann took back with the b pawn, that is a massive blunder. Then the key move, bishop to e5, forking the rook and the knight, and there is simply no way to defend both after the rook moves anywhere. Magnus Carlsen cleans up the knight, and he's going to have the bishop pair plus a pawn in exchange for the rook, and that is just way, way too much material. Now instead of that, here Hans Niemann does find the best move. That is rook takes c5, but the problem with this is here Magnus simply goes bishop to b4, and again the main benefit is this rook is going to fall, and we slowly simplify more and more pieces, and that means Magnus Carlsen's one pawn advantage on the queen side is going to be more and more important. So here, Hans Niemann, knight to e6, Magnus takes the rook, Hans takes back, and now Magnus starts the next phase of the endgame, pushing those queenside pawns down the board, getting a passed pawn. As we can see, Magnus Carlsen is going to slowly but surely just improve his position, push those pawns down the board, and now he has the passed pawn that he wants. So now the next phase of the endgame is he's going to push this pawn as far as he can down the board, threaten to promote, and distract the black pieces with the pawn. Then, when all of Hans Niemann's pieces are stuck over here on the queen side trying to cover, this bishop is going to come in and target this weak pawn on the g6 square. Of course, the rook can also do it, either one of these pieces. So let's see how Magnus Carlsen does it from here. As you can see, Magnus pushing his pawn down the board, centralizing his pieces, and then that bishop is ready to strike into the f7 square at some point. Now let's fast forward. Both sides guys continue shuffling, and finally the rooks come off the board. Rook takes d7, king takes, and bishop to f7, just as we said. That bishop on g6 cannot be defended. The knight is stuck over on the queen side. This is the principle of two weaknesses in the endgame. You typically want to have two weaknesses to attack, and here black is just stretched too thin. All of the pawns fall. Magnus Carlsen pushes the pawn down the board, and there is no way for Hans Niemann to stop that pawn from promoting, as well as this one. And in this position, Hans Niemann resigns on the spot to Magnus Carlsen. Wow, what a game by Magnus Carlsen, the GOAT, starting with the audacious move 1a3. Who does this guy think he is in this game? Magnus Carlsen?